What's the most disturbing secret you discovered about someone close to you? Before we go to the first story, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell to stay updated with us. Number 20. My great-grandmother was married to 3 different people at the same time. The men were from different branches of the military. She was collecting all 3 of their paychecks at a time. Is your family sure who your great-grandfather is? Number 19. My brother was stealing money from father who had dementia. This went on for a year, and then I found out about it was because the bank that had my father's mortgage called me wondering why it hadn't been paid in 6 months. My father's bank account went into the negative around this time too, and when I confronted my brother about it, he said, well, I hadn't paid my bills. I was about to take control of all the accounts and make sure shop got back on track, but my father ended up in the hospital and died shortly after that. My brother also stole some of my inheritance too. In the end, he stole over $5,000 from his dying father. Number 18. I found out that the reason why one of my uncles didn't want to go back to Korea when he retired was that he couldn't. He was fearful of political reprisals if he tried to return. Turned out his brother was part of the group that assassinated the ex-Korean president back in 1979. His own innocence was never proven, so he was in fear of getting arrested if he ever tried to go back. Number 17. Graduated boot camp and wondered why my brother wouldn't talk to me. Turns out he was f***ing my ex while I was there instead of delivering my letters. This guilt ate him up, and he thought it was simpler to keep up the lie and not have a brother, right up until an old friend from my hometown told me what happened. Number 16. My mom received birthday cards with money in them for years from her parents. She kept the cards with the money in them, saving to buy a piano/sentimental reasons. My sister, who was repeatedly stolen from family members, found the collection of cards/money and took them. My mom only wanted the cards back when she realized what happened. My sister denied everything. F you, Emily. Number 15. So my grandmother, who's been estranged from my family for a long time now for a multitude of reasons, has this weird thing where she has to share food with people. Are you ordering steak at the restaurant? Well, oh boy, she's had to word the same thing even if she doesn't like steak. Try her drink. It's really good. Take the first bite of chicken to let her know if it's any good. This always really annoyed me cause I hate sharing food. One day I brought it up to my mom and she was like, oh yeah, Grandma is afraid of being poisoned, so she wants other people to try it first. So let me get this straight. Grandma thinks someone is trying to poison her, so she asks me to try the food first. And it makes so much sense looking back because she literally would not take a bite of anything she ordered until someone else had a bite first. Next, Grandma. Number 14. I said something in general about horses one time. My good friend just kind of shrugged and said, ha. My uncle got f***ed to death by a horse. What the hell? Turns out my friend's uncle was the Mr. Hands Guy from the Seattle area. My friend was like, oh yeah, there's a whole movie about it and everything. It's called Zoo. Some town called Enumclaw, Washington is where this happened. I did look it up to see what he was talking about since he just blindsided me with the whole story. I don't really know why someone would claim such a thing if it weren't true, but perhaps he just wanted to shock me. We don't really communicate anymore due to changing jobs. I'm from Enumclaw. That story was horrible and still makes me sick to think about it. The farm owner had no idea what was happening on her farm. What makes it worse is that a pony statue was installed in town a few months before. It was horrible timing. Number 13. Just found out the other day that it wasn't my neighbor's dad who senselessly shot and killed my dog. It was his son, who I was close friends with. He did it on purpose. He knew how much the dog meant to me too. I also found out the other day where he lives. He's in my head now, so I'll just let nature or the police do their thing. Number 12. The reason Grandma moved away when my dad was still a baby to a big city, more than 3 days away from her family, was because she stabbed her stepfather and almost killed him. It was a very small village. Later she told me he was a rapist. She didn't elaborate on that, and I didn't ask any follow-up questions. She ended the convo with, I did the right thing. We never met her side of the family. Number 11. An uncle beat a guy almost to death with his bare hands. He had walked in on a friend molesting a kid. He had to pay a fine and do community service for a long time, but also didn't have to pay for beer at the local bar for a few months. He was so reserved and kind, so it threw me when I found out what he'd accomplished in his younger years. Number 10. I don't know how disturbing this is. It turned out pretty fantastic for one. but not for another. I was adopted and told a silly imaginal story about my birth parents, and most certainly did not seem true, even when I was a child. At 57, I learned I was the result of a college affair between a very seriously Jewish young man and a very Baptist young woman. She was rushed off to a home for wayward girls to give birth. He followed her there, many states away, begging her to keep me and live a life together. But their families both said absolutely not. Jewish people were not viewed as white in the mid-60s, and her family most certainly did not want her to marry a non-white. Plus, she was a very committed Christian and did not want to convert to Judaism. So off I went into another family. I recently discovered 3 lovely half-siblings, and we are all pro or semi-pro musicians and get along well. I never meant to meet my mother. She died a year before I searched. My father is out of the picture and wants to be left alone. And I'm fine with that. I'm grateful for the love he gave me. It was enough. Another person that was in my non-bio family was also adopted. She was older than me. She tracked down her mom later in life, too. She was in a hospital and had been since the day she was born. She was born holistically disabled, physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory, and was raped by an orderly. And she discovered she was the result. The endings to our search are not always happy. Number 9. The 24 hours before my dad died, stage 4 lung cancer. He was in the ER and then the ICU, and we were unable to be with him because of hospital COVID rules. My mother, sister, and I had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital, and going through his bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there, and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone, and all our texts had not been read, not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd, but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad had been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on. Why was he in the ER, etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having, at the very least, an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later I tracked the girl down and spoke to her, via DM, and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. It was her high school bus driver, and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died and dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a shitty secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad, with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I never found out. Number 8. I found out that my aunt, who was 13 at the time, was raped by her uncle, my great-uncle, and had a baby in a cellar in the basement of her house. The baby didn't make it, so she and her little sister had buried it there. Years later, when the aunt, who had repressed those memories, had a baby, she remembered it all. When her family found out, she was labeled the slut of the family. My dad's side is garbage. Number 7. Discovered that my sister stole my father's $25,000 Rolex, not more than 24 hours after he died. I only discovered it when she and her husband made a frivolous purchase, and I wondered where they got the money, since they were always broke and begging my parents for money. I got suspicious. It hit me that she might have stolen and sold the Rolex. Had the paperwork, ran a track on the sales history, and discovered it had been sold to a pawn shop down the street from where my sister lives. Went to the pawn shop, and after a bit of persuasion got them to tell me who sold it to them, and it was my sister. Me and my mom disowned her. Number 6. My grandfather beat someone to death. My dad was an only child, but my grandmother was once pregnant with my dad's younger brother. When she was 6 months pregnant, someone in construction equipment ran over the car she was driving, and she lost the baby. While she was in the hospital, my grandfather found the guy and beat him to death. From what I understand, He was in jail for about a week before he was released. Apparently, he claimed temporary insanity due to the circumstances. I learned all this about 4 years ago when my brother was researching family history and asked my grandfather about it. I've always seen him as a nice little man. Number 5. She was my best friend of 7 years. We had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her after about a year. We had no real ties to the state we'd have tried out, so we said, screw it. Let's go back. She's basically family. We were all so happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner, and we all laughed and talked and had a blast. Best year of my life. And slowly she started trying to turn my husband and me against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her infertility issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him. She just needed a sperm donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his sperm and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now, by the way. Number 4. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was the CEO of a major health fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, but that and the health fund role were largely built on the fraudulent qualifications and a progression of jobs also based on his claims. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting, and he'd had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job, and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly, and he ended up doing jail time. Number 3. I was pretty close with my youngest uncle growing up, at least in pictures. He was in his mid-20s when I was like 5 for context. One day when I was in middle school, he just stopped coming around completely. My entire family told us kids that he was backpacking around the nation. In high school, I was doing a genealogy project on my grandfather, his dad, and accidentally found my uncle's name on the sex offender registry. Come to find out, he was running a CP ring and had served 16 years in federal prison. He's out now, and my family pretends nothing happened. I stay far away. Number 2. Found a scrapbook of my mom and a guy I didn't recognize from her immediately post-college days. Turns out he was a long-term boyfriend of hers who killed himself when she broke up with him. My grandfather found his body. I learned at age 20, finding the book / shrine to him. All I can think of is how much that would have messed up your mother mentally. I hope she's okay. Number 1. One night as a kid, I heard my parents having an explosive argument in their bedroom, which suddenly went quiet. The door was closed and locked. I found out during a drunk phone call from my mother it was because she attempted to shoot my father in the face with a 303, but it didn't go off when she pulled the trigger as there were no bullets. They were both horrified and just stared at each other apparently. They're still together.
And that's all of the 20 best stories. If you like more of this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And if you have a similar or fantastic story, let us know in the comment below. I'll see you in the next video.